Good evening. My name is Jordan Karowski. I'm the president of Ratio Christi at Rutgers. Ratio Christi, which is Latin for the reason of Christ, is a student Christian apologetics group that equips students to give reasons and evidence for following Jesus Christ. We have weekly meetings where we wrestle with ideas relating to the intellectual credibility of Christianity. Everyone is welcome to attend, engage in the conversation, and ask questions in a friendly environment. Come join us at 9 p.m. on Monday nights at the College Ave Student Center in the Atrium Conference Room. Tonight, we are pleased to have Dr. William Lane Craig speaking to us. Yes, please. He's going to be speaking to us tonight on the existence of God and the beginning of the universe, as you can probably tell from all the posters. Dr. Craig is a professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and at Houston Baptist University. He earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, England, before taking a doctorate in theology from the University of Munich, Germany, where he was for 2 years a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Prior to his appointment at Talbot, he spent 7 years at a Higher Institute of Philosophy of Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. He has authored or edited over 40 books, including The Cosmological Argument, Theism, Atheism in the Big Bang Cosmology, and God, Time, and Eternity, as well as over 150 articles in professional publications of philosophy and theology. Please welcome Dr. William Lane Craig.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Our subject this evening concerns two topics that are among the grandest of philosophy and science: the existence of God and the beginning of the universe. Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and eternal, and that therefore the universe was uncreated. God may be responsible for bringing order into the cosmos, but he did not create the universe itself. This Greek view was in contrast to even more ancient Jewish thought about the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe has not always existed, but was created by God at some point in the past. As the first verse of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures states, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," Genesis 1:1. Eventually, these two competing traditions began to interact. There arose within Western philosophy an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years about whether or not the universe had a beginning. This debate played itself out among Jews and Muslims, as well as Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. It finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive end in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant held, ironically, that there are rationally compelling arguments for both sides, thereby exposing the bankruptcy of reason itself. What is the argument that prompted such debate? Well, let's allow one of the greatest medieval protagonists in this debate to speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. He was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day, under the influence of ancient Greek philosophy, were being led to deny God's creation of the universe. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Ghazali wrote a withering critique of their views entitled "The Incoherence of the Philosophers." In this fascinating book, which still repays reading today, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd. The universe must have had a beginning, and since nothing begins to exist without a cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Ghazali formulates his argument very simply, and I quote, "Every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins, therefore it possesses a cause for its beginning. So Ghazali's argument involves three simple steps. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. Two, the universe began to exist. And three, therefore the universe has a cause of its beginning. Let's look at each step in this argument. With respect to premise one, notice that Ghazali does not need a premise so strong as one in order for his argument to succeed. The premise could be more modestly stated as 1 prime. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. This more modest version of the first premise will enable us to avoid distractions about whether subatomic particles, which are the result of quantum decay processes, come into being without a cause. This alleged exception to premise 1 is irrelevant to 1 prime, for the universe comprises all contiguous space-time reality. Therefore, for the whole universe to come into being without a cause is for it to come into being from nothing, which is absurd. In quantum decay events, the particles do not come into being from nothing. As Christopher Isham, Britain's premier quantum cosmologist, cautions, care is needed when the word creation is used in a physical context. One familiar example is the creation of elementary particles in an accelerator. However, what happens in this situation is the conversion of one type of matter into another, with the total amount of energy being preserved in the process. And so this alleged exception to premise 1 is not an exception to 1 prime. Let me give then 3 reasons in support of premise 1 prime. First, something cannot come from nothing. To claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But if you deny premise 1 prime, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. Second, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer just pop into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that can come into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothingness, because there isn't anything to be constrained. And finally, number 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1 prime. The science of cosmogony is based on the assumption that there are causal conditions for the origin of the universe. So it's hard to understand how anyone committed to modern science could deny that 1 prime is more plausibly true than false. So I think that the first premise of the cosmological argument is surely true. The more controversial premise, rather, is premise 2, that the universe began to exist. This is by no means obvious. So let's examine both philosophical arguments and scientific evidence in support of premise 2. Al-Ghazali argued that if the universe never began to exist, then there have been an infinite number of past events prior to today. But, he argued, an infinite number of things cannot exist. Ghazali recognized that a potentially infinite number of things could exist, but he denied that an actually infinite number of things could exist. When we say that something is potentially infinite, infinity serves merely as an ideal limit, which is never reached. For example, you could divide any finite distance in half, and then into fourths, then into eighths, then into sixteenths, and so on to infinity. The number of divisions is potentially infinite in the sense that you could go on dividing endlessly. But you would never arrive at an infinity-f division. You would never have an actually infinite number of parts or divisions. Now, Ghazali has no problem with the existence of merely potential infinites, for these are just ideal limits. But he argued that if an actually infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. If we're to avoid these absurdities, we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exist. That then implies that the number of past events cannot be actually infinite. Therefore, the universe cannot be beginningless. Rather, the universe began to exist. Now, it's very frequently alleged that this kind of argument has been invalidated by developments in modern mathematics. In modern set theory, the use of actually infinite sets is commonplace. For example, the set of natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, has an actually infinite number of members in it. The number of members in this set is not merely potentially infinite, according to modern set theory. Rather, the number of members is actually infinite. Many people have inferred that these developments undermine Ghazali's argument. But is that really the case? Modern set theory shows that if you adopt certain axioms and rules, then you can talk about actually infinite collections in a consistent way without contradicting yourself. All this accomplishes is showing how to set up a certain universe of discourse for talking consistently about actual infinites. But it does absolutely nothing to show that such mathematical entities really exist or that an actually infinite number of things can really exist. If Ghazali is right, then this universe of discourse may be regarded as just a fictional realm, like the world of Sherlock Holmes and the Conan Doyle stories, or something that exists only in your mind. Moreover, Ghazali's claim is not that the existence of an actually infinite number of things involves a logical contradiction, but that it is really impossible. To give an analogy, the claim that something came into existence from nothing is not strictly logically contradictory, but nonetheless, it is really impossible. These modern mathematical developments, far from undermining Ghazali's argument, can actually strengthen it by providing us insight into the strange nature of the actual infinite. Now, the way in which Ghazali brings out the real impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences. Let me share one of my favorite illustrations, Hilbert's Hotel, the brainchild of the great German mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert first invites us to imagine an ordinary hotel with a finite number of rooms. Suppose, furthermore, that all the rooms are full. If a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room, the manager says, "Sorry, all the rooms are full." And that's the end of the story. But now, says Hilbert, let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose, once again, that all the rooms are full. This fact must be clearly appreciated. There is not a single vacancy throughout the entire infinite hotel. Every room already has a living flesh and blood person in it. Now suppose a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room 1 into room 2. The person who was in room 2 into room 3. The person who was in room 3 into room 4, and so on out to infinity. As a result of these room changes, room number 1 now becomes vacant, and the new guest gratefully checks in. But before he arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets worse. Let's now suppose, Hilbert says, that an infinity of new guests shows up at the front desk asking for rooms. No problem, says the manager. And he moves the person who was staying in room 1 into room 2. The person who was staying in room 2 into room 4. The person who was staying in room 3 into room 6, moving each person into the room with a number twice his own. Now, since any number multiplied by 2 is an even number, all of the guests wind up in the even-numbered rooms. As a result, all of the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests is easily accommodated. In fact, the manager could do this an infinite number of times and always accommodate infinitely more guests. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. As a student once remarked to me, Hilbert's Hotel, if it could exist, would have to have a sign posted outside, "No vacancy, guests welcome." But Hilbert's Hotel is even stranger than the great German mathematician made it out to be. For just ask yourself the question, what would happen if some of the guests start to check out? Suppose all of the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In this case, an infinite number of people has left the hotel. Indeed, just as many as remain behind. And yet there are no few people in the hotel. The number is the same, infinite. Now, suppose the manager doesn't like having a half-empty hotel. That looks bad for business, to be half occupied. No matter. By moving the guests as before, only this time in reverse order, he converts his half-empty hotel into one that is bursting at the seams. Now, you might think that by these maneuvers, the manager could always keep his strange hotel fully occupied. But you'd be wrong. For suppose the guests in rooms numbers 4, 5, 6, and so on check out. At a single stroke, the hotel would be virtually emptied, the guest register reduced to but 3 names, and the infinite converted to finitude. And yet, it would be true that the same number of guests checked out this time as when all of the guests in the odd-numbered rooms checked out. Can such a hotel exist in reality? Hilbert's Hotel is absurd. And since nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel, the argument can be generalized to show that the existence of an actually infinite number of things is absurd. Sometimes students react to Hilbert's Hotel by saying that these absurdities result because the concept of infinity is beyond us and we don't understand it. But this reaction is naive. As I said, infinite set theory is a highly developed and well understood branch of modern mathematics. These absurdities result because we do understand the nature of the actual infinite. Hilbert was a smart guy, and he knew well how to illustrate the bizarre consequences of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. Really, the only thing the critic can do at this point is just bite the bullet and say that a Hilbert's Hotel is not absurd. Sometimes critics will try to justify this move by saying that if an actual infinite could exist, then such situations are exactly what we should expect. But this response is inadequate, I think. Hilbert would of course agree that if an actual infinite could exist, the situation with his imaginary hotel is what we would expect. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good illustration. But the question is whether such a hotel is really possible. I don't think so. And so I think Ghazali's first argument is a good one. It shows that the number of past events must be finite, and therefore the universe must have had a beginning. We can summarize Ghazali's argument as follows. 1, an actual infinite cannot exist. 2, an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. And 3, therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. Ghazali has a second independent argument for the beginning of the universe. The series of past events, Ghazali observes, has been formed by adding one member after another. The series of past events is like a sequence of dominoes falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. But, he argues, no series that is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite, for you cannot pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. Now, this is easy to see in the case of trying to count to infinity. No matter how high you count, there is always an infinity of numbers left to count. But if you can't count to infinity, how can you count down from infinity? This would be like someone's claiming to have counted down all the negative numbers ending at 0. -3, -2, -1, 0. That seems crazy. For before he could count 0, he would have to count -1. But before he could count -1, he would have to count -2. Before he could count -2, he'd have to count -3, and so on back to infinity. Before any number could be counted, an infinity of prior numbers will have to have been counted first. You just get driven back and back and back into the past so that no number could ever be counted. But then the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. That shows that the series of past events must be finite and have a beginning. Ghazali sought to heighten the impossibility of forming an infinite past by giving illustrations of the absurdities that would result if it could be done. For example, suppose that for every one orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, they will approach a limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter. Of course, they will never actually arrive at this limit. But now, turn the story around. Suppose Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Which will have completed the most orbits? The answer is that the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. And you can't slip out of this argument by saying infinity is not a number. In modern mathematics, it is a number. It is the number of the elements in the set 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the greater the disparity grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become equal by making them orbit from eternity past? Another illustration. Suppose we meet someone who claims to have been counting down from eternity past and is now finishing. -3, -2, -1, 0. Whew. Why, we may ask, is he just finishing his countdown today? Why didn't he finish yesterday? Or the day before that? After all, by then, an infinite amount of time had already elapsed. So, if the man were counting at the rate of 1 number per second, he's already had an infinite number of seconds to finish his countdown. He should already be done. In fact, at any point in the past, he has already had infinite time, and so should already have finished. But then, at no point in the past can we find the man finishing his countdown, which contradicts the hypothesis that he has been counting down from eternity. Alexander Pruss and Robert Koons have recently defended an engaging contemporary version of Ghazali's argument called the Grim Reaper paradox. Imagine that there are infinitely many Grim Reapers. You are alive at midnight, but Grim Reaper number 1 will strike you dead at 1 a.m. if you are still alive at that time. But Grim Reaper number 2 will strike you dead at 12:30 a.m. if you are still alive at that point. Grim Reaper number 3 will strike you dead at 12:15 a.m. if you are still alive then, and so on and so forth. Such a situation seems clearly conceivable given the possibility of an actually infinite number of things. But it leads to an impossibility. You cannot survive past midnight, and yet you cannot be killed by any Grim Reaper at any time, because you would have already been killed before. Pruss and Koons show how to reformulate the paradox so that the Grim Reapers are spread out over infinite time rather than over a single hour. For example, by having each Grim Reaper swing his scythe on January 1st of each past year if you have managed to live that long. These illustrations only strengthen Ghazali's claim that no series which is formed by adding one member after another can be actually infinite. Since the series of past events has been formed by adding one member after another, it can't be actually infinite. It must have had a beginning. And so we have a second argument for premise 2, that the universe began to exist. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1. A collection formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite. 2. The temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition. 3. Therefore, the temporal series of events cannot be an actual infinite. Now, there are not only philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, but there are also striking scientific confirmations of the argument's second premise. One of the most astonishing developments of modern astronomy, which Al-Ghazali would never have anticipated, is that we now have pretty strong scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. The first scientific confirmation of the universe's beginning comes from the expansion of the universe. All throughout history, men have assumed that the universe as a whole was unchanging. Of course, things in the universe were moving about and changing, but the universe itself was just there, so to speak. This was also Albert Einstein's assumption when he first began to apply his newly discovered theory of gravity, called the general theory of relativity, to the universe in 1917. But Einstein found that there was something terribly amiss. His equations described a universe which was either blowing up like a balloon or else collapsing in upon itself. During the 1920s, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre decided to take Einstein's equations at face value. And as a result, they came up independently with models of an expanding universe. In 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble, through tireless observations at Mount Wilson Observatory, made a startling discovery which verified Friedmann and Lemaitre's theory. He found that the light from distant galaxies appeared to be redder than it should. And this red shift in the light was most plausibly due to the stretching of the light waves as the galaxies are moving away from us. Wherever Hubble trained his telescope on the night sky, he observed this same red shift in the light from the galaxies. It appeared that we are at the center of a cosmic explosion, and all of the other galaxies are flying away from us at fantastic speeds. Now, according to the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, we're not really at the center of the universe. Rather, an observer in any galaxy will look out and see the other galaxies moving away from him. This is because, according to the theory, it is really space itself which is expanding. The galaxies are actually at rest with respect to space, but they recede from one another as space expands. The Friedmann-Lemaitre model eventually came to be known as the Big Bang theory. But that name can be misleading. Thinking of the expansion of the universe as a sort of explosion could mislead us into thinking that the galaxies are moving out into a pre-existing empty space from a central point. And that would be a complete misunderstanding of the model. The theory is much more radical than that. As you trace the expansion of space back in time, everything gets closer and closer together. Eventually, the distance between any two points in space becomes zero. You can't get any closer than that. So at that point, you've reached the boundary of space and time. Space and time cannot be extended any further back than that. It is literally the beginning of space and time. Now, to get a picture of this, we can portray our three-dimensional space as a two-dimensional surface which shrinks as you go back in time. Eventually, the distance between any 2 points in space becomes zero. So, space-time can be represented geometrically as a cone. And what's significant about this is that a cone can be extended indefinitely in one direction, but it has a boundary point in the other direction. Because this direction represents time and the boundary point lies in the past, the model implies that past time is finite and had a beginning. Because space-time is the arena in which all matter and energy exist, the beginning of space-time is also the beginning of all matter and energy. It is the beginning of the universe. Now, notice that there's simply nothing prior to the initial boundary of space-time. Let's not be misled by words. When cosmologists say there is nothing prior to the initial boundary, they do not mean that there is a state of affairs prior to it, and that is a state of nothingness. That would be to treat nothing as though it were something. Rather, they mean that at that boundary point, it is false that there is something prior to this point. Or alternatively, it is true that there is not anything prior to this point. The standard Big Bang model thus predicts an absolute beginning of the universe. If this model is correct, then we have amazing scientific confirmation of the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. So, is the model correct? Or, more importantly, is it correct in predicting a beginning of the universe? Despite its empirical confirmation, the standard Big Bang model will need to be modified in various ways. The model is based, as I said, on Einstein's general theory of relativity. But Einstein's theory breaks down when space is shrunk down to subatomic proportions. We'll need to introduce subatomic physics at that point to craft a quantum theory of gravity, and no one is sure how this is to be done. Moreover, the expansion of the universe is probably not constant as in the standard model. It's probably accelerating and may have had a brief moment of super rapid expansion in the past. But none of these adjustments need affect the fundamental prediction of the absolute beginning of the universe. Indeed, physicists have proposed scores of alternative models over the decades since Friedman and Lemaitre's work, and those that do not have an absolute beginning have been repeatedly shown to be unworkable. Put more positively, the only viable non-standard models are those which involve an absolute beginning to the universe. Now, that beginning may or may not involve a beginning point. But on theories such as Stephen Hawking's famous no-boundary proposal, those that do not have a point-like beginning still have a finite past, not an infinite past. The universe has not existed forever, according to such theories, but came into existence even if it didn't do so at a sharply defined point. In a sense, the history of 20th century cosmology can be seen as a series of one failed attempt after another to avoid the absolute beginning predicted by the standard Big Bang model. That prediction has now stood for nearly 100 years during a period of enormous advances in observational astronomy and creative theoretical work in astrophysics. Meanwhile, a remarkable series of singularity theorems has increasingly tightened the loop around empirically tenable models by showing under more and more generalized conditions that a beginning is inevitable. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. And that theorem applies to multiverse scenarios too. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail, for other reasons, to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning," end quote. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time, under a single, very general condition, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Now, of course, scientific results are always provisional. We can fully expect that new theories will be proposed attempting to avoid the universe's beginning. Such proposals are to be welcomed and evaluated. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear which way the evidence points. Today, the proponent of Al-Ghazali's cosmological argument stands comfortably within the scientific mainstream in holding that the universe began to exist. Now, As if this weren't enough, there is actually a second scientific confirmation of the beginning of the universe, this one from the second law of thermodynamics. According to the second law, unless energy is being fed into a system, that system will become increasingly disorderly. Now, already in the 19th century, scientists realized that the second law implied a grim prediction for the future of the universe. Given enough time, all the energy in the universe will spread itself out evenly throughout the universe. The universe will become a featureless soup in which no life is possible. Once the universe reaches such a state, no significant further change is possible. It is in a state of equilibrium. Scientists called this the heat death of the universe. But this unwelcome prediction raised a further puzzle. If, given enough time, the universe will eventually stagnate in a state of heat death, then why, if it has existed forever, is it not now in a state of heat death? If in a finite amount of time the universe will reach equilibrium, then given infinite past time, it should already be in a state of equilibrium. But it's not. We're in a state of disequilibrium, where energy is still available to be used, and the universe has an orderly structure. The 19th century German physicist Ludwig Boltzmann proposed a daring solution to this problem. Boltzmann suggested that perhaps the universe is, in fact, in a state of overall equilibrium. Nevertheless, by chance alone, there will arise more orderly pockets of disequilibrium here and there. Boltzmann referred to these isolated regions of disequilibrium as worlds. Our universe just happens to be one of these worlds. Eventually, in accord with the second law, it will revert to the overall state of equilibrium. Contemporary physicists have universally rejected Boltzmann's daring many worlds hypothesis as an explanation of the observed disequilibrium of the universe. Its fatal flaw is that if our world is just a chance fluctuation from a state of overall equilibrium, then we ought to be observing a much smaller patch of order. Why? Because a small fluctuation from equilibrium is vastly more probable than the huge, sustained fluctuation necessary to create the universe we see. And yet, a small fluctuation would be sufficient for our existence. For example, a fluctuation that formed a world no bigger than our solar system would be enough for us to be alive and would be incomprehensibly more likely to occur than a fluctuation that formed the entire universe that we see. In fact, Boltzmann's hypothesis, if consistently carried out, would lead to a strange sort of illusionism. In all probability, we do inhabit a smaller world, and the stars and the planets we observe are just illusions, mere images on the heavens, so to speak. For that sort of a world is much more probable than a universe which has, in defiance of the second law of thermodynamics, moved away from equilibrium for billions of years to form the universe we see. The discovery of the expansion of the universe in the 1920s modified the sort of heat death predicted on the basis of the second law. But it didn't alter the fundamental question. If the universe will expand forever, then it will never actually arrive at equilibrium. Because the volume of space is constantly growing, the matter and energy always have more room to spread out. Nevertheless, as the universe expands, its available energy is used up, and it becomes increasingly cold, dark, dilute, and dead. It will eventually become a thin gas of subatomic particles endlessly expanding in absolute darkness. By contrast, if the universe is not expanding fast enough, then the expansion will eventually slow down, come to a halt, and then gravity will pull everything together again in a catastrophic big crunch. Eventually, everything in the universe will coalesce into a gigantic black hole from which the universe will never reemerge. Whether its end will be fire or ice, the fundamental question then remains the same. If given sufficient time, the universe will reach such a state, why is it not now in such a condition if it has existed forever? Recent discoveries indicate that the cosmic expansion is actually speeding up. Because the volume of space is increasing so rapidly, the universe actually becomes farther and farther away from an equilibrium state in which matter and energy are evenly distributed. But the acceleration of the universe's expansion only hastens its demise. For now, the different regions of the universe become increasingly isolated from one another in space, and each marooned region becomes dark, cold, dilute, and dead. So again, why isn't our region in such a state if the universe has already existed for infinite time? The obvious implication of all this is that the question is based on a false assumption, namely that the universe has existed for infinite time. Today, most physicists would say that the matter and energy were simply put into the universe as an initial condition, and the universe has been following the path plotted by the second law ever since its beginning a finite time ago. Of course, attempts have been made to avoid the beginning of the universe predicted on the basis of the second law of thermodynamics, but none of them so far has been successful. Skeptics might hold out hope that quantum gravity will serve to avert the implications of the second law of thermodynamics. But in 2013, the cosmologist Aaron Wall of the University of California was able to formulate a new singularity theorem which seems to close the door on that possibility. Wall shows that given the validity of the generalized second law of thermodynamics in quantum gravity, the universe must have begun to exist unless one postulates a reversal of the arrow of time. That is to say, time runs backwards at some point in the past, which, he rightly observes, involves a thermodynamic beginning in time, which would seem to raise the same sorts of philosophical questions that any other sort of beginning in time would. Wall reports that his results require the validity of only certain basic concepts, so that it is reasonable to believe that the results will still hold in a complete theory of quantum gravity. So, once again, the evidence confirms the truth of the second premise of Ghazali's cosmological argument. On the basis, therefore, of both philosophical and scientific evidence, we have good grounds for believing that the universe began to exist. It therefore follows that the universe has a cause of its beginning. But what sort of cause is this? What properties must this cause of the universe possess? Well, this cause must itself be uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. It is therefore the first uncaused cause. It must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. Therefore, it must be immaterial and non-physical. It must be unimaginably powerful, since it created all matter and energy. Finally, Ghazali argued that this uncaused first cause must also be a personal being. For it's the only way to explain how an eternal cause can produce an effect with a beginning, like the universe. Here's the problem. If the cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect must be there as well. For example, the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees Celsius. If the temperature has been below 0 degrees from eternity past, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity past. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. Now, the cause of the universe is permanently there, since it is timeless. So why isn't the universe permanently there as well? Why did the universe come into being only some 14 billion years ago? Why isn't it as permanent as its cause? Well, Ghazali maintained that the answer to this problem is that the first cause must be a personal being, endowed with freedom of the will. His creating the universe is a free act which is independent of any prior determining conditions. So his act of creating can be something spontaneous and new. Freedom of the will enables us to get an effect with a beginning from a permanent, timeless cause. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Now, this is admittedly hard for us to imagine, but one way to think about it is to envision God existing alone without the universe as changeless and timeless. His free act of creation is a temporal event simultaneous with the universe's coming into being. Therefore, God enters into time when he creates the universe. God is thus timeless without the universe and in time with the universe. Ghazali's cosmological argument thus gives us powerful grounds for believing in the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. And this gives greater significance to the first verse of the Hebrew Scriptures, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
We're going to start asking questions now, so if you could just keep your voices down, be considerate.
Dr. Craig,
Okay.
even granting the distinction which you emphasize between coordinate time as described by the Minkowski interpretation of the special theory of relativity and parameter time allowed for by the general theory of relativity, is in time, even in the latter, a fundamentally physical phenomenon. Other physical phenomena such as mass and gravity have an empirically observable effect on time, not merely our measure of it, resulting in time dilation. If this referent of the word time is indeed fundamentally physical, how then, except by analogy or equivocation, could it in actuality relate to the metaphysical time you propose, that is, a neo-Newtonian absolute cosmic time? Put another way, how precisely do you define physical time and metaphysical time? How are they distinct, and how do they relate to one another?
All right, there's a lot of background to that question that most of you won't have had and understand. He's referring to my work on God's relationship to time. And what I argued is that the quantity that goes under the name time in physics isn't really time. It is our physical measures of time, and in different fields of physics, different measures are used, so that there is no unitary or unified concept of of time in physics, these represent, I think, simply physical measures of time. Moreover, I think time can exist without any physical measures whatsoever. We could imagine God counting 1, 2, 3, 4, let there be light. And in that case, that series of mental events alone is sufficient for time. So what we have, I think, in physics is at best measures of time, not time itself. So then the question arises, which is what he was asking about, is then how do these two things relate? And what I suggested is that the cosmic time that plays a role in general relativistic models is a rough measure of God's metaphysical time, because this cosmic time measures the duration of the universe from its beginning. It is a universal, observer-independent time that measures the proper time of the universe, how long the universe has existed. And it would seem to me that that would be the duration of the amount of time since God created the universe. So the way they would relate, I would say, is that the universe is a clock. It's God's clock. Just as I use this mechanical device on my wrist to measure how fast time goes by for me, I think the universe is God's clock. And that would be how I see them relating. It's a mechanical device that measures the proper time of the duration of the universe.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to first thank you for all your work that you do and this wonderful talk tonight and coming here. My question relates to the second philosophical argument that you give for why the universe has a beginning. I was wondering if you could comment on why the number of events in the past can be thought of as set formed by successive addition. To me, it seems like it might be logically possible that the number of events in the past are infinite and therefore cannot be thought of a set formed by successive addition.
I think you can avoid this premise by adopting a theory of time according to which temporal becoming is an illusion, according to which the difference between past, present, and future is just a subjective feature of human consciousness. This is sometimes called a tenseless theory of time, because on this view, there is no objective present or past or future. Events in time are strung out in a line in the same way that events are in space. And so on this view, it is not as though the past was formed one event at a time, one occurring after another. The whole timeline just exists, and our past is just relative to where we are on the line and what is earlier than that point. And so I supplemented my work on the cosmological argument by an extensive investigation of these competing theories of time and published 2 books on this: The Tenseless Theory of Time, A Critical Investigation, The Tensed Theory of Time, A Critical Investigation. And my studied opinion, for which I argue, is that the tensed view of time is correct. Temporal becoming is an objective and real feature of reality, and therefore, in fact, the series of past events really has been formed by successive addition. So if you're interested in pursuing that further, take a look at the work that I've done on God and time. A nice student level book would be called Time and Eternity, published by Crossway Books. That contains the essential arguments in it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I too thank you for being here. I have a kind of a struggle. Many people assume that God's omniscient, and so if this assumption's true and God's knowledge is just as infinite as He is it logically possible for God to ever exercise a free act of the will Himself, like deciding to say, "Let there be light"? or for us to have free will either? Or should we reconsider our assumption about his foreknowledge?
The Bible testifies to God's foreknowledge of the future. It actually uses the word prognosis, from which we get our word prognosis, right? Prognosis, foreknowledge. And there's a whole series of words in the New Testament with that prefix, pro-martureo, to foretell, pro-orizo, foreordain, prognosko, foreknow. So the Bible teaches very clearly that God foreknows the future, and then it contains abundant examples of prophecies of events in the future that are highly contingent and couldn't have been inferred from present causes. For example, Jesus predicting that Peter would betray him 3 times before the cock crowed twice. There's no way, even from Peter's weak character, that he could have inferred such a specific and highly contingent prophecy as that. So I think we have good grounds from Scripture for affirming divine foreknowledge of the future, including the free acts of people. And the claim that this robs us of freedom, I think, is a fallacious argument called fatalism. Fatalism characterized ancient Greek thought, and the church fathers argued very strenuously against fatalism. They didn't see any inconsistency between God's foreknowing the future and that future being free. And the arguments that, that there is some kind of incompatibility here, I think, are either invalid or they are based upon highly questionable premises. I would say that even though you can be certain from God's foreknowledge of X that X will happen, that doesn't mean that X will necessarily happen. Don't make the fallacious slide from certainty to necessity. X will happen, but it could fail to happen. But if it were to fail to happen, then God would have had different foreknowledge instead. So God's foreknowledge is kind of like an infallible barometer of the weather. From the infallible barometer's reading, you know what the weather will be, but the barometer doesn't affect the weather. And if the weather were to be different, then the barometer would have had a different reading. Do you see what I mean? And that's as long as you've got that counterfactual relationship of the past to the present, you can have the ability to choose A or not A. What you cannot do is fool God. You can choose A, and if you do, he'll know you're going to choose A. You can choose not A, but if you were to do that, then he would have known that instead. So you have the complete freedom to do A or not A. You just don't have the freedom to deceive God about that. Oh, by the way, again, if you're interested in that, a little book that I wrote on that would be a nice student introduction. It's called The Only Wise God, The Compatibility of Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Craig. I've been corrupted by contemporary analytic philosophy, so please understand where I'm coming from. My question is this: how is existential import shown in any argument, especially one that postulates a necessary being, since any logically conclusive argument is definitionally syllogistic? And therefore, can't we only state with any reasonable certainty only that which is probable?
Well, the argument that I've offered is a probability argument. The second premise, in particular, that the universe began to exist, I don't claim to know that with certainty. I said it's far from obvious. So this is a probability argument.
That answers the question.
Pardon me?
That answers the question.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Glad it was so easy.
So with the fact that, or the conclusion that God began the universe at what I guess we would call the Big Bang, or at a moment, and it began to, and it expanded and then came to where we are today, would mean that he would have had to intentionally set in motion all the events leading up to today, which would be forming of the universe and the world and humans. So for him to have set that intentionally into motion would imply that when he set the world into motion, it was in a deterministic fashion, that every event like presupposed the next ones, and that everything, like Laplacian celestial mechanics, that kind of determinism. So where would human free will fit into a determinism?
Boy, these are really good questions. And fortunately, these are things that I've studied. Your question is about divine providence, about God's control of human history, and particularly how can he providentially and sovereignly direct a world of free creatures toward his previsioned ends. How can he do that without turning them all into puppets, as you say, making them causally determined? And I think the answer is that God has a certain kind of knowledge that theologians call middle knowledge. And this is his knowledge of what any person would freely do in any set of circumstances that God might place him in. So, for example, God knew what Pilate would do if he were the prefect of Judea in the first century and Jesus were brought before him on trial. He knew what you would do if you had been the prefect of Judea at that time. He knew what Susan would do if she had been in a similar situation. And by actualizing certain circumstances and then placing free persons in them, knowing how they would freely choose, God can weakly actualize the results of their choices. So he doesn't need to causally determine them. Those that he causally determines, he strongly actualizes, like the Big Bang, for example. But then things that involve freedom or indeterminacy, he would weakly actualize by setting up the circumstances and putting the people in them, knowing how they would freely choose, and then getting the outcome as a result. Do you understand the answer, whether you agree with it or not? Okay, so that would be the theory I would defend. I have a strong view of divine sovereignty and providence, and it would be through this so-called middle knowledge. This is also talked about in the book, The Only Wise God.
All right, thank you.
Hello, Dr. Craig.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. I enjoy your videos on YouTube.
Good.
Can I ask a question that doesn't deal with the beginning of the universe? So my question is, what are scholarly sources that support the divinity of Jesus and his resurrection?
No, can you speak a little more clearly, please?
What scholarly sources are out there that support the divinity of Jesus and his resurrection?
The divinity of Jesus?
Yes.
Well, there's a very good book on this. Bart Ehrman, who is an ex-Christian, who is now writing a lot of very skeptical things about Jesus, wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. And in response to this, a number of scholars got together and issued a book by way of reply at the same time entitled How God Became Jesus. And it's an excellent book on the divinity of Christ and how the divinity of Christ is not some sort of later development within the Christian church, but goes right back to the life and personal claims of Jesus himself. So I would highly recommend this book. I think Michael Bird, B-I-R-D, is one of the editors of the book, How God Became Jesus. In addition to that, on the resurrection, well, I've written some things on this. For example, I have a little book called The Sun Rises, S-O-N. And although that's somewhat dated now, I think all of the arguments that are in it are still good ones, because really when you're dealing with the New Testament, it's not as though you have new data to deal with. You're just gaining insights into the material you have. But subsequent work has been done by N.T. Wright in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is a massive study. And then Dale Allison has a book on Jesus' resurrection, where he subjects the resurrection to really very strict scrutiny. It's very skeptical, very hard-nosed and objective, and it's all the more impressive then that Allison comes out in the end affirming things like the historicity of the discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and so forth. So those are a few sources that are very good on these questions. Thank you.
In your talk, it seemed like there was a bit of a jump from there is a beginning of the universe to there is a creator to there is a personal creator, which
Right.
you didn't seem to elaborate very much as to how you knew it was a personal creator. Additionally, how do you move from such a personal creator to the specific creator described in the Bible, which you've referenced a couple of times now in this talk?
Let me address the second question first. The talk this evening concerns a kind of generic monotheism that would be common to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And indeed, this argument that I've described has been defended historically by Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And the person that I used as my springboard was Al-Ghazali, the Muslim medieval theologian. So to move beyond this generic theism to Christian theism, I think you've got to look at the person Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is the most influential human being in history. Our whole system of dating dates from this man's birth, AD, BC. And anybody who is an, I think, intelligent and educated person needs to have some understanding of Jesus of Nazareth and who they think he is and what they think of his claims. And so I would argue that when you look at the claims of Jesus of Nazareth and the historical credibility of God's raising him from the dead, that will move us beyond monotheism to a Christian monotheism. Now let me go back to the first question about why the cause is personal. In my published work, I give 3 arguments for the personhood of this cause. The one that I share tonight is one from Al-Ghazali. It is an earmark of medieval Islamic theology. And the argument goes like this. If the cause of the universe is a mechanically operating, impersonal set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then once the sufficient conditions are there, the effect has to be there. If the effect isn't there, then the conditions aren't truly sufficient. But once the necessary and sufficient conditions are there, the effect should be there as well. So if there has been this eternal, timeless, permanent cause of the universe, which the argument drives you back to, why isn't the universe permanent? Why hasn't it always existed? Why did it only begin to exist around 14 billion years ago? And the way these medieval Muslim theologians answered this was through what they called the principle of determination. That is to say, it is a function of free will to distinguish like from like. There's a very famous medieval illustration of this called Buridan's ass, where John Buridan imagines a donkey caught between 2 equally appetizing bales of hay. And he starves to death because he doesn't have the freedom to arbitrarily choose one of the bales of hay. Well, now, in Al-Ghazali's writing, he has his own sort of illustration. Ghazali imagines a man with 2 equally appetizing dates, the kind you eat, I mean. 2 equally appetizing dates. And he says, it is a function of the freedom of the will to be able to distinguish like from like and just arbitrarily choose to eat one of the dates rather than the other. So apply this to this dilemma. How do you have an eternal, permanent cause, but an effect with a beginning? Freedom of the will. Free will can simply produce a spontaneous new effect without any prior determining conditions. And therefore, it is through freedom of the will that you can solve this problem, and that would imply that we're dealing then with a personal, self-conscious agent.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up then?
Yes.
In that case, because if you're saying, I don't think that there needs to be will to arbitrarily choose between something. A random number generator could do the same thing. It can arbitrarily choose between a set of different things that doesn't have any will.
Not if it's deterministic. I mean, I think you're not thinking. I mean, it would have to be a quantum system to be truly indeterministic, right? If you're talking about a macroscopic machine that picks numbers, it's not indeterministic. If the causal conditions are present for a certain number coming up on the dial, then they will. Okay.
Good afternoon, Dr. Craig. I've gotten to know you pretty well after all these years, but you still don't know me. And it's a pleasure to see you tonight.
Thank you.
Through YouTube, that's how. My question is simple. Tonight you have labored to argue for God's existence, and you stopped there. My question is, since God exists, how can we know Him, and how can we be with Him?
Yeah. This is related to the question that was asked just a moment ago. I am a Christian theist, not simply a theist. And so if you were to ask me why I'm a Christian theist, I would share with you about the historical credibility of the person of Jesus of Nazareth described in the Gospels, his teachings, his personal claims about himself, and then his resurrection from the dead. I did my doctoral studies at the University of Munich in Germany on the historical credibility of the resurrection narratives in the New Testament. And although by that time, being a Christian, I believed in the resurrection, I was stunned, frankly, to discover that the central facts undergirding the historicity of Jesus' resurrection are agreed to by the majority of historical New Testament critics today who have written on the subject. And I think these can be classified as three in number. One would be the burial and empty tomb of Jesus. Secondly, his post-mortem appearances to various individuals and groups. And then thirdly, the very origin of the first disciples' belief that God had raised him from the dead. These represent the conclusions not of conservative scholars, but of the broad mainstream of New Testament historical Jesus scholars today, people who teach at secular universities and non-evangelical seminaries, including a good number of Jewish scholars today. And I can't think of any better explanation of those facts than the one that these original disciples gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's true, the significance is that it means Jesus was who he claimed to be. It means that those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified were vindicated by the God allegedly blasphemed by him, publicly and unequivocally vindicated, and therefore he was who he claimed to be. And that then in turn means that Jesus holds the key that unlocks the door to eternal life. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And I believe that through Jesus we can find eternal life and a relationship with God. And not having been raised in a Christian home myself, I for many years was in despair. I felt the existential anguish and absurdity of life that I later learned French existentialists described. And it wasn't until a girl who sat in front of me in my German class, my sophomore year in high school, one of these types that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I said to her one day, I said, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, why would he want to do a thing like that? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. that the God of the universe could love me, that worm named Bill Craig down there in that speck of dust called planet Earth. And I just couldn't take it in. And I went home that night, I found a New Testament that had been given to me by the Gideons in the 5th grade when they visited our grade school, and I began to read the Gospels, and I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about this man's teaching that I had never encountered before, and there was an authenticity about his life that was just undeniable. And to make a long story short, after about 6 months of the most intense soul searching I ever have been through, I came to the end of my rope and committed my life to Christ, to serve Him, to know Him, to own Him as my Savior and the Lord of my life. And that turned my life completely around, and it's never been the same since.
Thank you.
Hello. I was just wondering to what extent, if at all, you've been influenced by early Christian teachings after the 2nd century.
Well, I do try to give allegiance to the creeds, such as the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition. I don't, as a Protestant, think that the creeds have the same authority of Scripture. I think that we even need to bring the creeds before the bar of Scripture and judge them by how well they accord with Scripture. But having said that, I do want to affirm with the early church fathers that Christ was one person in 2 natures, that the Trinity is one substance with 3 persons, each having the full divine nature. So I suppose to that extent, I have been influenced. Were you thinking of something else?
I was just wondering if any of the earlier writers like St. Athanasius or St. Augustine have something to say or to add to what you've been talking about.
Oh, not with respect to this argument, no. This argument tended to originate in the efforts of 3rd century commentators on Aristotle, and then it really got rolling during the medieval period in Islam, because what happened was the corpus of Aristotle and Plato was largely lost to the West because of the barbarian invasions of Rome. But these works were preserved in the Arabic culture and world. And then, as the Muslims rubbed shoulders with Jews in Spain, they began to mediate this back to the Latin-speaking West through the Jews, and these same arguments then became a matter of great debate and controversy. So that tended to be much later, really medieval. During this earlier time, there was a real eclipse of this sort of thing among the church fathers because this work was largely lost.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening, Dr. Craig. Thanks for coming to Rutgers University, and thank you for wearing school colors.
Oh, thank you.
How are you? Yeah. In addition to what you already mentioned, I was curious, were there any other specific events in your life or philosophical readings that inspired you to study religion at the university level and still do what you do today?
Yes. When I graduated from Wheaton, I picked up a book on a clearance table by Stuart Hackett called The Resurrection of Theism. And I had been taught in college by my philosophy professors that there were no good arguments for the existence of God, that they'd all been refuted, and therefore the best you could do would be to provide a kind of negative defense of belief in God by saying atheism leads ultimately to despair and absurdity and meaninglessness, and here you would use the French existentialists and others to show the sort of nihilism of an atheistic worldview, but a purely negative sort of defense. And then I began to read Hackett's book, The Resurrection of Theism, and he began to defend these various arguments for God's existence. And to my shock, to answer all of the objections to them that I had always read. And the centerpiece of Hackett's book was this argument that I've shared tonight. Now, he didn't call it the Kalam argument because I think he was largely unaware of the Islamic roots of this argument. But he was defending this version of the cosmological argument. And that just lit the fire within me. When I went on for graduate studies in philosophy, reading Frederick Copleston's monumental history of philosophy, I began to learn then about the Jewish and Islamic and medieval roots of this argument and realized that Hackett's argument wasn't new, but had this rich, centuries-old history. And I thought, if I could study this in depth someday, I would like to settle my mind about that. And so when I went to Birmingham to do my PhD work in philosophy, under Professor John Hick, I asked if I could write on the cosmological argument for God's existence. And it was then that I was able to satisfy my mind about this argument and to go into it historically and then in the contemporary philosophy in considerable depth. And so that the real turning point was Hackett's book. It's amazing how just picking up and reading a book can make such a huge difference in a student's life and setting his career path on a certain direction. But that, for me, was very important.
Thank you for your time.
Hello, Dr. Craig. My question today concerns an objection to the Kalam cosmological argument as an argument specifically for God. You've argued that naturalistic alternatives to God as the cause of the universe all fail because they're necessarily spatial or temporal. But it seems to me that a similar line of argument can be extended to God, specifically his temporal nature. I would argue, or someone else might argue, that God being a mind must be temporal because consciousness or thinking requires change, specifically God's mental states. So how would you respond to an objection of inadequacy to your argument?
In the book, Time and Eternity, that I referred to before, there is a whole chapter on the possibility of atemporal personhood. That is to say, can you have a timeless person? And I'm persuaded that these features of consciousness that you mentioned that require temporality, like anticipating or remembering or deliberating, are either not essential to personhood or else can be exhibited by an atemporal person. So I would refer you to that discussion and see if it goes through. I think that, as Brian Leftow has put it, although an atemporal person may not be your garden variety person, there isn't anything incoherent about the idea of a changeless, self-conscious, free agent. So take a look at those arguments and see if you find them helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Turn my depth up. I want to sound real deep right now. Thank you for joining us. This is more of a picking your brain question than trying to eliminate anything you said earlier. Given that these cosmological arguments kind of have their roots in rationalistic thought, but in your presentation there seems to be somewhat of a reliance on empirical findings. I was curious, do you find yourself to be an empiricist? And if not, and you find yourself more to be on a rationalist strain, where do you land in terms of logicians or philosophers of language that you might endorse or sympathize with?
Well, I'm not an empiricist in the sense of thinking that all knowledge comes through sense experience. I'm rather partial to the Kantian idea that the soul or the mind has a certain categorical structure to it that enables it to interpret the data of sense experience, and that it brings this a priori to experience. Otherwise, experience would be unintelligible. So I would be sort of a rational empiricist, I guess, in that sense, a combination of the two. And I think that there can be a priori knowledge that isn't gained simply through sense experience. But I do have a tremendous interest, a genuine interest in natural science and tremendous respect for the natural sciences. And so I always like to explore what does our empirical investigation of nature tell us about the question that I'm working on, and to try to do a synoptic study that will take into account the deliverances of the natural sciences as well as purely philosophical considerations.
If I might do a brief follow-up, if you are some kind of a neo-Kantian, do you embrace the transcendental idealism, or have you rejected it as many?
Say the last part again.
Do you embrace his transcendental idealism, or have you rejected it as many commentators have?
No. That would be one of the criticisms that I think one would lodge of Kant, where he says that the categories do not apply to things in themselves, and therefore we have no knowledge of things in themselves. All we know is mere appearances. I think that that is not something that we should affirm, and is probably even incoherent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless all your work. I actually have a few questions.
You should probably limit yourself to one because there are folks behind you. So pick your most important.
Okay. Most important? Is there any scientific significance of God creating the heavens and the earth before bringing light into existence?
I don't think so. I don't think that we should think of Genesis 1 as a scientific treatise. The expression heavens and the earth in Hebrew is an idiom meaning the universe. They didn't have a single word in their vocabulary for the universe. So when the ancient Jew wanted to speak of everything, of the universe, he would say the heavens and the earth. And so I think what verse 1 tells us is that in the beginning, God brought the universe into existence. And then the remainder of the chapter is about how life on earth, or about how God made the earth a habitable place for humanity. And I don't think that you should try to read details of modern science into what is a very figurative narrative.
Thank you.
I've heard you say in videos on YouTube that you do believe that the modal ontological argument formulated by Alvin Plantinga is a valid argument which logically works in proving the existence of God. Now, the argument goes about proving the existence of God by rightly defining God as a maximally great being, which would be a being that has all of the great-making properties at a maximal level. One of those properties being existence. My question is, by what objective methods can we use to determine what are greater-making properties by which we use to define God, and how we could use these methods to uncover existence as a greater-making property to respond to Immanuel Kant's refutation that existence is not a property at all?
Okay, there's a couple of questions going there. Even if existence isn't a property, I think we can say that necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. Something that's contingent doesn't have to exist. And its existence is usually dependent upon something outside of it that is a cause of it. But in the case of necessary existence, this is surely a great-making property, because this sort of thing must exist. In any possible world, this thing will exist. And that would be greater than something that just happens to exist in some possible worlds, but not all. But in regard to your more general question, I think it's going to be a matter of basic intuitions, just what seems to be great-making to you, as opposed to not. So, and some things surely are great-making properties, like omnipotence. A being that is all-powerful is surely greater than a being that is weak and limited in power. A being that's omniscient, knows everything, would be greater than a being that is ignorant. On the other hand, is it greater to be timeless than temporal? That's far from obvious, I think. That's not clear. Is it greater to be simple rather than composite? Again, that's not clear to me. So in many cases, it could well be the case that we're not certain what is great making. But the ones that Plantinga picked, a being that is omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect, those are surely all great making properties. A being that has those is greater than a being that is limited in strength, limited in knowledge, and morally imperfect. And then the idea is that it's conceivable that there should be a being that would have those properties in every possible world. And if this is a coherent concept, then such a being must exist. And after being initially skeptical of the ontological argument, as a result of reading Plantinga's work, I did come to believe it's not simply valid. I think it's a sound argument. It does seem to me that it's possible that there be such a being, and that therefore it follows that it does exist. So I've changed my mind and come to view this as a good argument.
Thank you.
My question is about one of your responses to the previous questions about the historical Jesus. Now, your arguments for Jesus being who he said he was are very rooted in historical methodology.
Yes.
Yes. But in John 14:6, Jesus makes the universal claim, I am the way, the truth, and the light. So is it possible to investigate the historical Jesus without first answering true or false to that claim? And if not, how can one use historical methodology to argue for the truth of the resurrection?
Well, I would say almost unequivocally, yes, it is possible to do that before knowing the truth of that claim. Why would you think otherwise?
Because it affects every decision you make as a historian on how to handle the evidence going forward.
Well, you know, I don't think that's true. I mentioned that these central facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus, such as his honorable burial or his entombment by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of that tomb's being empty on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion by a group of his women followers, the post-mortem appearance of Jesus to various individuals and groups on a variety of circumstances and locations, and then the transformation in the earliest disciples coming to believe suddenly and sincerely that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Those facts are acknowledged by Jewish scholars investigating Jesus, as well as by non-evangelical scholars investigating Jesus. So it seems to me that the objective historian can establish these facts independently of believing that Jesus is divine or the way, the truth, and the life, and so forth. Now, where he might balk then would be making the inference that the best explanation of this is God raised him from the dead. I think many of these scholars will simply remain agnostic at that point. They will simply say, we don't know what happened. Something happened, but we don't know what it is. But then I think the Christian will say, I think that the resurrection hypothesis, when judged by the standard criteria historians use in assessing historical hypotheses, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, and so forth, that it passes those tests and does so better than any rival hypothesis, and therefore one is well within his rational rights in believing the resurrection hypothesis. So I don't think that you have to make that kind of a determination that you mentioned prior to looking at the evidence. On the contrary, I think the evidence could actually lead you to coming to that point and making such a decision. I think I'm going to have to come back to Rutgers and give a talk on the resurrection of Jesus sometime. We keep getting questions about it. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Why bother trying to prove God? Shouldn't this be faith-based? And also, why bother trying to use science to do it when science studies in the universe and God's outside of the universe?
I think there are two levels at which we could answer this question. First, when you look at the example of Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament, they didn't just say to people, have faith in God or have faith in me. Jesus, in fact, said, if you do not believe my word, then believe in me because of the works that I do. The miracles that he performed were evidence to the people that the kingdom of God was breaking into human history in his person. And the apostles, if you read the book of Acts, in dealing with non-believing audiences, would appeal to God's handiwork in nature when talking to pagan audiences as evidence for God's existence. Think Romans 1 or Acts 17. And with Jewish audiences, they would appeal to Jesus' miracles, fulfilled prophecy, and then especially his resurrection from the dead, to which they were witnesses. So the example of Jesus and the apostles, I think, ratifies this sort of approach of using argument and evidence to persuade unbelievers. The second thing I would say is that culturally, if Christians are to be relevant in an increasingly secular Western society, it is vitally important that faith not become a privatized sort of experience, but that we be able to commend our faith rationally in the public square. I cannot tell you how many emails we get almost every week from people who have either come back to the faith after having walked away from Christ, or who have come to faith for the first time because they've seen a YouTube video of a debate, or they've seen a video of a talk or something, and they have said, for the first time, I saw that there were rational grounds for believing in God or believing in Christ. So it's really important, I think, that we do this. Western culture, since the Enlightenment, thinks that theology is not a source of knowledge. It's just a faith experience. And if we want to commend that theology is a source of genuine knowledge about God, then I think we need to show how it integrates into the whole body of knowledge at the university, and that will include the natural sciences as well.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to say thank you. You know, I think that we take for granted sometimes. You know, I feel like we're a little spoiled. You know, you guys, you've done an amazing thing. Your whole kind of generation, I think, really. Yeah, I listened to you guys and just a lot of apologists, and I think we take for granted how comfortable we now feel. My generation, at least, in being able to share our faith.
Really?
So yeah, I think you guys.
That's
really,
marvelous news. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I think you really, you know, you guys were the pioneers, and I'm really grateful to that. So the question is this, really, maybe like from an analytical point of view, it's really an existential question. I've spoken to people who can say something like, well, listen, I have this struggle in me to be a moral person. I have that morality, that kind of, you know, that stuff that all of them wrote about, Dostoevsky and all of them. But I don't see anything perfect in nature, in reality. So how can I believe in something that's perfect? So how can that person, they're kind of living with this inconsistency, right? So yeah. They want that, they have that desire to be perfect, but they can't kind of, you know, bow the knee, as it were, because they don't see anything or experience anything perfect on a moral level.
Yeah, I think this is a person who is ripe for coming to a knowledge of God, because I really doubt that a person will come to find God as a personal reality in his life without first having a deep sense of sin and need of forgiveness and moral cleansing. And so a person who recognizes the demands of the ethical life and who recognizes his desperate inability to live up to the demands of the moral law and to approximate the moral good is a person who has a deep existential need. And I would think that such a person might be very open to a moral argument for God's existence, where you would point out that in the absence of God to serve as a paradigm of moral value and a source of moral duty, that moral values and duties are just human illusions fobbed off on us by the evolutionary process and social conditioning. And so if he really does sense the demands of the good and of the moral law and the objectivity of these duties that are laid on him, he automatically has grounds for a transcendent good or being that perfectly embodies the moral ideal and whose commands then give us the content of our moral duties. And so that kind of argument, I think, would be very persuasive to someone of the sort you've described for believing in God as the source and foundation for the moral good. And there are a lot of good Christian works on this today.
Could you recommend something for the reading?
Steve Evans just published a little book on this. Or there's a book by Dave Baggett, I think called, what is the title of it? Something like Good God or something of that sort. David Baggett and Jerry Walls have a book on this. Those are popular level books. There are lots more sophisticated books like Robert Adams' book on finite and infinite goods, but these popular level books would be good intros to that. So something like Stephen Evans' recent book on moral values in God.
All right. Thank you. All the best.
Yeah.
First off, thank you very much for coming to Rutgers University. The first thing, I kind of just want to speak to the whole like faith and reason for like 2 seconds, you know, why. A lot of people say people aren't won over by arguments. I have to say I was one who was won over by William Lane Craig. About 4 years ago. Wow. So you were highly influential on changing my beliefs. So my question would be, and I think you mentioned Robert Coons. Are we talking about the same one? The one at University of Austin?
Yes.
At Princeton?
UT Austin.
Currently? Yes. So he has an interesting view on time, his A-B theory. And if mistake me, correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much what I'm going to say is, how do you view the moving spotlight theory of time, where temporal becoming can be viewed as God writing a book, then beginning to read it? So God would create the universe, then God would have a relationship with that time, and as God sees time passing, that is what we see. That.
Unless this has been developed in some more sophisticated way that I'm not familiar with, it seems to me that that commits the fallacy that the philosopher C.D. Broad described of postulating a time above time, a kind of hypertime, because time would be, say, the different events temporally ordered as earlier than and later than, and then the moving spotlight wouldn't be in the same time. That would be a hypertime where they become illuminated one after another. So in effect, all it does is add a second dimension to time. And I can't think of any good reason to do that. There are more than one dimension of space, but I don't see any reason to think that there's more than one dimension of time. And if you do add on a second temporal dimension, I think all of the problems will just return to haunt you on the hyper level that you confronted on the first level, so that it doesn't really contribute anything.
And also, to speak to the resurrection, what are your beliefs on, can the Shroud of Turin be any evidence for the resurrection?
You know, I'm fascinated by that relic. But I think until the carbon dating tests are reversed, it would be imprudent to appeal to that as evidence. Now, I've read the literature about the carbon dating being taken from a later fragment that was used to repair the shroud, and other chemical tests have ratified a first-century date and so forth. But nevertheless, it seems to me that unless these tests are rerun and those results are overturned, that it wouldn't be prudent to appeal to the shroud as evidence of first-century events. Yes.
Hi, and thank you for coming. Just as a reference also, I believe Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote about Jesus as well, the actual resurrection. That's just a reference for the people who are asking.
Yeah, he didn't write about the resurrection, but he refers to Christus, who some think was Christ. Josephus is the one who has the most about Jesus. And I think that this is an authentic passage in the Antiquities where
I just thought that might help. I do have a question, though.
Okay.
The question is on predestination, not necessarily predetermination of mankind's actions, but predestination of salvation. Is it God just knowing who will believe, or is he choosing who believes? Something we could shine some light on that. I know it's a deep topic.
Well, that is a deep topic, and Christians have different views on that we don't need to settle tonight. People who come out of the Reformed tradition will say that God unconditionally elects some to salvation and passes over others. But other Christians will say, no, God respects the free choice of individuals and therefore allows them to determine by their response to his grace whether they will spend eternity with him or whether or not they will irrevocably reject God and be separated from him forever. And in that case, what God would foreordain would be at most the circumstances in which those persons would be created, and what gifts of grace would be offered to them, and what persons would be created. But he wouldn't predetermine how they would decide to respond to his offers of grace. So this is an in-house debate among Christians.
So grace is conferred to all then, objectively?
Excuse me?
A certain amount of grace is objectively conferred to all to possibly believe?
On the second view, yes. On the second view, there is common grace that even unbelievers receive. Well, even the Reformed grant that. But the idea would be that saving grace is offered to many, but that grace is not irresistible. For the Reformed thinker, God's grace is irresistible, as saving grace, I mean, and therefore it will win affirmative free response from the person to whom it's given. But on non-Reformed views, grace is typically thought to be resistible by the creaturely free will, and so God does offer saving grace that will become efficacious if it meets with a positive response on the part of the human person.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been a big fan for a while, and I want to bring questioning back to some of the topic for tonight. I've heard you bring up the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem in plenty of debates, lectures, as evidence of the beginning of the universe as a theorem with classical space-time. But I've also heard people like Cross or Carroll, Strong Carroll, your debate with him a year ago, bring up actual, like, Alexander Vilenkin's email that Cross brought up, or a picture of Guth with his iPad saying, hey, perhaps it's eternal, who knows, we don't know. And then you had an interesting response at which Carroll was pretty critical of you of just saying maybe that's his personal hope. And so I just was wondering if you could speak to Carroll, Cross. They seem to say that you're misrepresenting science. They seem to say you're misrepresenting the theory. Then they bring them up. And I'd just be interested to hear what you have to say about the BGV theorem.
I mean, that's definitely not true, the part about misrepresentation, because I'm in conversation via email with Alexander Vilenkin. And he has said you have accurately represented what I've said. And I think I posted those emails and showed how Krauss deliberately deleted portions of the Vilenkin quotation that he gave, where he had ellipsis points, that he deleted crucial sentences that cast a different light on it. So that was just a distortion on his part. Now, in the debate with Sean Carroll, if you look at that carefully, I tried to address the question of whether quantum effects would serve to restore the eternality of the universe. And what I said there accurately is that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows that under a very general condition, classical space-time must have a beginning. And as I said tonight, it takes you back to a boundary. If there wasn't anything on the other side of that boundary, that was the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side of the boundary, that was the regime discovered or described by the yet-to-be formulated quantum gravity theory. And in that case, that regime is then the beginning of the universe. But that cannot and did not endure for infinite past time up until that boundary point. This regime is a quantum regime. It is called, therefore, metastable, and cannot endure through infinity, doing nothing, and then suddenly transition to classical space-time. So I think if you look at that debate, you'll see that it's accurately anticipated and stated. And then also I offered the Wall theorem that I quoted again tonight, where Aaron Wall says that these results will apply within the quantum gravity regime, showing that unless you have a reversal of time zero at some point in the past, it implies a beginning of the universe. And even with a reversal of time zero, you still have a thermodynamic beginning of the universe that is just as problematic philosophically as a geometrical sort of beginning.
Yeah, thank you. As a student of Robin Collins is actually very helpful, so thank you.
Wow, okay,
Yeah.
good.
From
Well,
the
you're
side.
studying under a really top-notch guy. Okay.
Dr. Craig, good evening. I just want to say, again, thank you for coming. I followed some of your work, and I'm a little familiar with your past things, so I appreciate that. And I want to say it's also encouraging to have fellow Christians look into science and philosophy and have them in support of God, and open up an open floor for open discussion. With that, my question is kind of touching on the sovereignty, and a few other people have mentioned this before, where I agree with you in you saying that knowing the future as God knows what will happen does not mean he is implicitly dictating what will happen. I think you called it more of a weak knowledge. My question is, how do you reconcile that with Jesus directly saying to his disciples, I think it's in John 15, where you did not choose me, I in fact chose you.
Yeah. Don't you think that that was talking about the 12 disciples?
Correct.
That he chose them.
Yes,
right?
of course.
So I don't think that you can generalize that to teach some sort of general doctrine of unconditional election. It seems to me that was a historically conditioned statement. And even then, one of the 12 apostatized, right?
Oh,
Judas,
right, yes.
Which shows that he had freedom of the will. So I don't think that Jesus saying, I chose you to be my 12 disciples is meant to say you don't have free will.
Oh, no.
Or that I have unilaterally elected you to salvation.
No, correct. I do believe in free will as well. And,
Okay.
and taking it more, you're taking an Arminian stance versus a Calvinism stance. But I guess it's more dealing with you have saying where you're more seeing of God knowing if I put, or if someone is in this situation, I would know how he would react.
All right. No, my view is perfectly compatible with saying that God says, there's Susie. I would like her to go to heaven, so I'm going to place her in circumstances where I know she would freely respond to my grace and be saved. it's compatible with that sort of thing.
Okay, correct. Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
My question is more about apologetical technique than I guess anything you presented tonight, more like the way you approach apologetics. So how would you suggest that a presuppositional apologist use natural knowledge in his argument?
Well, I mean, as I understand classical presuppositional apologetics, such as Cornelius Van Til and Gordon Clark, there really isn't any room for that sort of argumentation like I've offered tonight. They invite you, as it were, to simply step into their worldview, accept its presuppositions, and then see if that doesn't make sense of reality. Now, some presuppositionalists, like Greg Bahnsen, have offered a kind of transcendental argument for God's existence that I think is very amenable to the sort of approach I offer tonight, where one might argue that you need God as a kind of necessary condition or assumption in order for us to be able to trust our rational faculties and arrive at truth and things of that sort. That kind of transcendental argument has been defended by quite a number of folks today, and I would see that as in line with the sort of approach I've taken tonight. But I don't like the sort of classical presuppositional approach, which seems to me to be just begging the question, saying, assume that our view is true, and then showing that it's true.
I agree with everything you said tonight in your defense of what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity. Being a Coptic Orthodox Christian, the sacraments are an important part of our Christian life. Regarding the Eucharist, in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, prior to the idea of transubstantiation introduced by the Roman Catholic Church, when Greek was universally understood, the early Christians believed the Eucharist to be the true body and blood of Jesus Christ. It was not until the 16th century that Martin Luther introduces the idea of the Eucharist as a mere symbolic representation of what it truly was. Looking at the early historical church, the writings of the church fathers, who were the disciples of the eyewitnesses of Christ, it seems to me that the Eucharist is the true body and blood of Jesus Christ. What are your thoughts on the Eucharist?
Well, I don't see any reason to go into this tonight. This is an in-house debate among Christians, but if you're interested in my view, I have a class that I teach weekly called Defenders, and it's a survey of Christian doctrine and apologetics. And one of the sections of the class is the doctrine of the church, or ecclesiology. And in this section, we have several lessons on the sacraments or the ordinances. Are they sacraments or are they ordinances? And if they are sacraments, how do you interpret the presence of the body and blood of Christ in them? And I lay out the different views. Proponents of these different views have told me personally they thought that I do so fairly and accurately. And then I try to assess these in terms of biblical teaching. As I said, as a Protestant, I take every church tradition before the bar of Scripture rather than simply follow tradition. And so I'd refer you simply to those Defenders lectures on doctrine of the church and the subsection on the sacraments to see my take on this.
Hey, Dr. Craig. It's my first time hearing you speak. My question was, tonight you've described the finiteness of the universe and how that means there was a beginning and therefore God exists. What is your response to those who would question this connecting logic that because existence is finite, therefore there's a beginning and thereby God exists? And those people might perhaps argue that, hey, this might be just the beginning of the universe. Might agree with you that there was a beginning of the universe, but that it might be a spontaneous emergence. And this doesn't necessarily mean that there is a theistic originator.
Yeah, if you look at the published work that I've done, particularly in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, where I have a professional physicist as my co-author, we look at these other models, including quantum physical models, with a view toward this question of whether or not they successfully restore the past eternity of the universe. And I would reiterate what I summarized tonight in saying that the only viable, non-standard models on tap today are universes that involve a finite past and a beginning. I am not aware of any model that is successful and tenable in giving us an eternal past. So that you would just look at the individual models and then scrutinize them. This is what Vilenkin did in that 2012 paper that I mentioned, and what my colleague Jim Sinclair does in the Blackwell Companion article as well.
But with this model, where is the connecting logic for God that arises?
Excuse me?
Where's the connecting logic that brings in the existence of God with your model?
I'm not sure I understood the question. You're saying that where does God arise in the model?
Yes.
Well, it's the argument that I gave earlier this evening as to why this first uncaused cause must not only be immaterial, timeless, enormously powerful, but also personal. This gives us a personal creator of the universe. Now, that's not a full-bodied concept of God, because it says nothing about the moral properties of this being. So if you don't want to call this being God, that's fine with me. But what it does give you is a very rich concept of an enormously powerful, timeless, changeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused, personal creator of the universe. Yes.
Thank you for coming tonight. I just had a question about middle knowledge. So I find middle knowledge to be very compelling, but I just don't understand that if via middle knowledge God has chosen the situation in which a person will act, how is it that that person freely acts in that situation, considering the fact that God has chosen that situation for that person to be in?
You're saying how could he act freely?
Yes.
Well, the key idea here is that the circumstances need to be non-determining. They are circumstances in which the person is causally, it's up to him to choose A or not A. And if God weren't watching, so to speak, you know, to use a metaphor, if God weren't looking, if God sort of turned his eyes, the person would be exactly in the same circumstances. Nothing would be different, and he would have the ability to do A or not A, and God's just knowing about it doesn't do anything to take away his freedom. And if you don't see the point with freedom, think about an indeterminate event on the quantum level. Assume that quantum indeterminacy is real, that these subatomic events could go either way. And God knows that if the particle were at this time and place, that it would decay at this other time and place. That doesn't do anything to remove the indeterminacy from that quantum physical situation, right? It's still completely indeterminate, even though God knew when and where it would decay.
But hasn't God created the situation in which the person would choose to do such a thing?
He has created the situation, yes, in which the person would freely choose to do something. But that way of describing the situation might lead you to think, well, there's something about the situation that would make the person do it that way, and that would be wrong. It's God creates this person, he creates him in this situation, and God knew that if he were in that situation, this is what he would freely do.
Okay. Thank you.
So, yeah.
All right, well, that concludes the evening. You guys are very welcome to give him another round of applause.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you folks.
Dr. Craig, we really can't thank you enough for coming out. And just to plug it one more time, we do have Ratio Christi every Monday night in the College Ave Student Center, and this is what we do. Not that good, but this is what we do. So please come out at 9 p.m. Mondays in the College Ave Student Center atrium. You've probably been there 1,000 times. Thank you so much for coming out.